Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Current Works. Current Works is a lecture series featuring leading figures in the worlds of architecture, urbanism, design, and art. I am Mario Gooden, a member of the Architectural League's Board of Directors and its Vice President for Architecture. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to our event and to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Walter Hood, for this Current Works series. Walter Hood is a creative director and founder of Hood Design Studio. Based in Oakland, California, the studio defines itself as a cultural practice working across art, fabrication, design, landscape, research, and urbanism. Hood combines architectural and the arts expertise with a commitment to designing ecologically sustainable public spaces that empower marginalized communities. Throughout his career, Walter has transformed traffic islands, vacant lots, and freeway underpasses into spaces that challenge the legacy of neglect of urban neighborhoods. Through community engagement, his work investigates the natural and social histories of a place, as well as the aspirations of its current residents. Walter is a recipient of the 2017 Academy of Arts and Letters and Architecture Award, and in 2019 was awarded the Knight Foundation Public Place Fellowship, a MacArthur Fellowship, and the Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize. He is also the David K. Wu Chair and a professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning at the University of California, Berkeley. He was recently the spring 2020 Diana Bell Morey visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture. Most recently, Walter is the editor of Black Landscape Matters, published by the University of November Press and just released in November of this year. I'm also happy to be joined by my other dear friend and colleague, Professor Mabel O. Wilson. Mabel Wilson is also a member of the Architectural League's Board of Directors, and she is the Nancy and George E. Rupp Professor in Architecture at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Mabel is also a professor in the African American and African Diasporic Studies Department and the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia. She is the co-editor of Race and Modern Architecture, published this year, and has authored Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, published in 2016, and Negro Building, African Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums, published in 2012. Please join me now in welcoming Walter Hood. And before Walter comes on, just let me say that we're grateful to have this program supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. I would also like to mention that we co-sponsor this program with the Irwin S. Channing School of Architecture at the Cooper Union. Now, please join me in welcoming Walter Hood.
Thank you, Mario. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually in New York and the Architectural League, and my other colleague, Mabel. I look forward to our conversation a little later. Share my screen here. Is my screen visible, Mario?
It is, but oh, there you go.
Okay, thank you. In speaking tonight about my recent work, I'd like to just highlight, some of the things from Hood Design Studio. As Mario said, we think of ourselves as a cultural practice, not really thinking like social practice or even engaged locally at the community level. To me, culture begins to suggest place and people. And as we know, growing in the global sort of world, that place is becoming less specific, but it's really about those people who live in those landscapes. And so our practice goes between this idea of the everyday and the mundane, trying to look at places where people don't normally look to. Commemoration, it's about really memory and remembering, and this idea of the life way, that different people in different places live in different ways. And our practice, we commingle these three different ways of thinking together, and each project might allow one to rise to the top, but we're interested in all three as we make the work. And the work has been, how can I say, plentiful in the last few years, but we've found ourselves working, one, in the public realm a lot, in a lot of places, and on the other hand, for a lot of institutions, as you see here, the Broad Museum, the De Young in San Francisco, and the Cooper Hewitt. But we also make projects with institutions, whether it's the Kapoor Center, which looks at health, or Bayview Opera House, which looks at performance and theater, to radical places like People's Park, which we're redesigning as we speak. But the work also really doesn't create a specialty. It's a way of working, it's a process. And whether we're at the scale of 1,000 acres, like in Pittsburgh, or to the scale of an alley in Philadelphia, like Pearl Street, we're always trying to listen to the local, but also pushing to get people to see landscape differently. A case in point, we were hired in Philadelphia to turn Pearl Street into a park. And again, having to work through with the client to talk about what's a park and why an alley should be valued. That's where the work, I think, sort of gets its sort of genesis. Our practice is also a lot of the times in urban areas, we introduce art in the public realm. And we find that art is another challenge in the public realm as a way to bring beauty to places that sometimes don't get beauty, but it also begins to challenge the aesthetic, right, of a place like Coastlines in Los Angeles, which is in Wilmington, which is an industrial landscape that has no inert material where historically there was sandstone. And through these narratives and stories, the project tries to reveal a landscape, one, that has been denied and lost in memory, or two, connecting people back to their way of life. I want to take you through a series of projects that we're currently working on. This first one is Knock in Arlington, Virginia. And we were hired to come to Arlington and work with a local community that was part of a larger diaspora that goes back close to 120 years, and this would be to Arlington Cemetery, to one of the first freedmen's villages in the country. And neighbors of this landscape kept talking about Green Valley. And so Green Valley is the name of a local pharmacy that's on the historical register. But once talking with the residents, Green Valley was the larger landscape of Arlington that constituted the diaspora. And at the end of the day, all they have left is the small park space that they're calling the town square. So working with them, we developed a conversation around the idea of the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Village, but we also created a new green space for the community. And within that, we were able to exhume an old creek that came through and create a new performance space that you see here on the top. But more central to the idea was this notion of having a conversation with the community around what does it mean to be freed? That a lot of Africans, African Americans, people from the African diaspora did not come here and receive freedom in the beginning. We were let go. And so standing in the middle of the project will be a 40-foot gold-plated sentinel that will read freed, F-R-E-E-D. And it will sit in this luscious bucolic landscape, almost as a sentinel, pushing between this kind of semiotic of the romantic. You'll find this statement and a point of conversation around different types of activities that will take place, such as performances, but it also becomes the beacon to this lost landscape. Another project that we've recently began to work on is the September 2nd Memorial in San Bernardino, California. This is where terrorists came into a public space on a Friday afternoon and pretty much massacred 14 individuals who work for the city. All of San Bernardino County came to the rescue of the 14 people. And by the end of the day, the assaulters were taken down, but also people came to their aid and came to their space. And so next to the county building, we've created 14 rooms, and we call this the curtain of courage. And in these 14 rooms, each person who was assassinated will actually be commemorated. And this is part of this public way where residents as well as workers will move into this building daily. And so the mundane act of arrival somehow comes together with commemoration. And hopefully people will never forget as they look back out to the mountains and as the courageous curtain creates this new space for people to come mourn, but also celebrate the lives of the 14 victims. Hopefully in the next month, this project, Oakland Museum of California, will be reopening. This project opened in 1968. Roach and Kiley were the designers, Kevin Roach, Dan Kiley. This is one of the most, what can I say, green civic spaces in Oakland. It's probably one of the first roof gardens in the country. As you can see here, a lot of the plant materials sit on the roofs of the building. We've been working with the museum to take a look at this 50-year-old structure. And as one might sort of be aware, after 25 to 30 years, plants change. After 50 years, they change a lot. We were able to sort of take out all the plants in the planters, finding that a lot of the places where plants were planted, they were not suitable for planting. As you can imagine, in these early days, this notion of putting plants on the roof of a building was very novel, and we know much more today. So we were able to save most of the trees that were acclimated, which are mostly the native trees and the Mediterranean trees. And we've come up with a new planting approach for the larger building top. And through this, we're making new dirt that will allow the plants to come back in over time. And through this, it will reinforce the architecture, which was part of the earlier goals of the plan. And so hopefully in the next 20 years, the Oakland Museum will become again. And we're using the museum as a mechanism, as a way to talk about the different biomes of California, from the low desert all the way to the coastal prairie. And each sectional level will actually have a different landscape. So when you come in from the top, you'll go through Mediterranean. And as you come in from the bottom, which is terra firma, you're actually coming through a real coastal forest. And these relate back to the galleries inside as well. The site plan, as you can see, by removing the plants, you actually see the architecture anew. And through this new architecture, we're able to see this wonderful concrete work. We're able then to realize that the planting was a cultural landscape 50 years ago, and that knowing more about climate and knowing more about sustainable practices, we're able to replant in a completely different way. Again, this is coming from the high desert, lots of succulents that then take you back around, and you arrive at the second level, where then you get this California landscape that begins to open up along these long axial views. And then at the center part is the new lawn. We've removed the diagonal and created more of a social space. In the last couple of years, the museum has discovered that people love to come to outdoor spaces. They started the first Friday night, then it became every Friday night. So sitting here around that edge in this new coastal forest, we've created places for people to sit on those existing walls. We brought in a new stage. The stage will be actually a permanent new revenue generating element, but it becomes a very simple minimalistic frame that looks up into the sky. And from the stage looking back, the terraces become an amphitheater. And this was probably a big discovery as we were working, the way the building sort of rises up like a ziggurat. It becomes a perfect auditorium for outdoor venues. And then probably the piece de resistance for this one is we open the museum up. So now when you come towards Lake Merritt, you can actually walk directly into the museum. This used to be a concrete wall that was completely solid, closed. And from the inside, you're able to see the lake. And once we made these openings, everyone knew that this was the right move for the project. You can see we cut the openings where there was the slabs and where there were the columns, not to disturb the previous work. And so this is construction as we see it today. You can actually see the openings looking towards the lake. And having those apertures and being able to see water, the estuary, will bring a powerful view back into the garden. And then looking back out, you're able to discover Oakland. The frame takes your eyes up, looks back towards the courthouse, and the redwoods get cleaned out, new ferns planted underneath. This is going to be a really wonderful new courtyard and town square for the city of Oakland. During the pandemic, we worked on the East Coast on a couple of different projects. This first one is La Villa in North Florida, Jacksonville. And this was a landscape in which we were asked to come in and redesign a vacant space that would pay homage to the Johnson brothers. And the Johnson brothers wrote the song, the classic African-American anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. I remember first being introduced to the Johnson brothers in the 3rd grade, where we actually had to read their creation poem. And that poem stays in my head because it was one of the first things I've ever memorized. The Johnson brothers, born late 19th century in a small house located 3 blocks from the train station. And what's fascinating and probably pretty typical of the time, the train station was the place where people arrived, but it was also the neighborhood where most working class people settled. It's where the red light districts sort of set up. And so being asked to design what we call Lift Every Voice and Sing Park, we became very, very intrigued by the neighborhood that surrounded it. And instead of designing the park, we've designed a heritage plan for Jacksonville that has a series of elements that take you on a loop that tell you the story of a landscape that was lost. And this landscape that was lost was the commercial street, where there is nothing left, literally. And there will be a series of public art frames where we're working to enlist photographers to come in and actually bring images in the public realm. The Ritz Theater, we're redesigning a new space for this old historic theater. The Great Black Way, we're trying to reintroduce a lot of the nomenclature that that was established in a lot of African American neighborhoods. The Great Black Ways were entertainment districts. The Line was a fascinating landscape. And doing the research, we found that there were over 200 brothels that were located along here, and they were all owned by the women. And they were also places in which people like the Johnson brothers actually cut their chops, because these were the flop houses where the musicians could come and actually play music. And so our first assignment was the park. And thinking about the park, what we wanted to do was create a place that drew its inspiration from the memory of the place that was erased. And we're very fortunate that one of the city bureaucrats actually preserved 3 shotgun houses, and they put them in a separate lot. And when we were privy to them, I asked them, could we actually use one of them? And so we're taking an existing shotgun house and moving it to this space. And we've also suggested that the other 2 go to other spaces. And the shotgun house then becomes the memory keeper. it becomes the place in which we can tell a story in a landscape that's been completely erased. And so arriving from the train station, instead of going with the current bike trail that will take you to the east, we've created our loop, which takes you to the west. And across the street, every time there is a new design, the street actually changes and becomes part of that. The Shotgun House becomes a billboard to tell the story of what happened in this neighborhood. As part of the experience of Lift Every Voice and Sing, we've created an amphitheater. So when you arrive from the north, you actually see Lift Every Voice. And from the south, you see the Shotgun House. As this piece of lawn is lifted up, there's a fountain that reveals itself. And it's a place for kids to come and cool themselves in the really hot Florida summers. It's also a place where we've created a garden that's particularly commemorative for the Johnson brothers and their songs and their poetry. On the backside where the new housing, we've created what we're calling Poets Row. And this is where all the poetry from the Johnson brothers will be displayed three-dimensionally. So even neighbors on just daily can come out, sit along the promenade and think about Johnson, whereas the others might be tied to performance. And sitting from the hill, then looking back down, the Shotgun House really becomes an amplifier. We're cutting up, opening in one side and building a stage. And it becomes the amplifier as you look back south towards the train station. This next project is in Princeton. This project is entitled Double Sights. And Double Sights takes its name from one of Du Bois's writings. It's really came about from the students that you see here who are protesting the chancellor as well as the college, the Woodrow Wilson School of Business. And they basically wanted his name to come off the school. The African-American students went to the chancellor's office, locked themselves in. And what happened after that was the trustees created an endowment for a memorial or for a commemorative piece. And the commemorative piece was supposed to deal with Wilson's good side and his bad side. We were one of 3 architectural firms selected, and we ended up being chosen as the winner. The project is very simple. It's 2 vertical elements, and the one vertical element rests on the other. One happens to be black, and the other happens to be white. And we took liberties here to talk about this binary, thinking of the larger cultural context, but also thinking about privilege and this notion of privilege and how privilege gets to rest on the back of those who are not privileged. It also began to set up a way to begin to have a conversation around a man who was privileged, and he didn't have a consciousness to actually think about the people who were subjected to a lot of the laws and a lot of the norms of the day. So inside the piece, as it opens up, are all of his detractors, everyone from Trotta to Ida B. Wells, those who pushed him to be a good man. And we know this story all too common of the privileged who gets pushed one try after another, and in the end doesn't come through. So from the distance, the piece is reflective as stone glass, and it reflects the entire context around it. Again, on the inside are the words of his detractors if you go up and read, and they're larger than the words on the outside. The words on the outside are carved into the stone, and these are all of Wilson's words. And we were literally about putting those words in white and black. It mutes those words until you get up close. And once you get up close, you're able to sort of understand the man. And then at night and by day, there's a lenticular piece on one side that shows the faces through the years of those who champion either male or female, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. And then looking up, it's the consciousness that gets the power, not the man on the outside, but those voices on the inside that rise up and force you to kind of think differently. In Double Sights, even once it was revealed, was still protested. And I told the students during Black Student Union Week that I love that the space was a place of protest, but they still wanted everything to deal with Wilson to come down. And at one point, at the beginning of the year, I thought that the protest would even overreach and maybe even the marker would come down, which we talked about in the office, and maybe the piece served its time. We then got a call later, late fall, late spring, early summer, that the trustees had met. And to my surprise, they had voted to take the name of Wilson off the school. The dean of the school told me that one of the trustees came out and possibly read the marker, read the writings, and reading those writings by Wilson changed her mind. And next, the last project I'd like to share is the International African American Museum, which is located in Charleston, South Carolina. It's currently under construction, designed by the late architect Harry Cobb. This project has been a lifelong kind of push by Mayor Riley and some of the other academics as well as politicians in Charleston to get a building up in a place where we know more than 40% of the African diaspora crossed over into North America. It also will be a place where people can come and actually research your history. So the museum is twofold. One, it looks out to the east, back towards Africa. Two, it looks more towards the west, back to Charleston and the Low Country. And between the two, there will be this new experience created. Charleston is situated in the neck, and you see the International African American Museum located off to the right here, located directly on the water's edge. It's a project that has had many beginnings, different starts and stops. The site was not always here. This was a site that came to revelation through a few different things, a conversation between the mayor and Harry Cobb, as well as an article that researched the site, which is called Gaston's Wharf. And in this article, the archaeology suggested that the wharf was located here, and that at this space, this is where the slaves were held in the warehouse that you see, this long bar building off to the right, and then sold off into bondage. And again, you know, as most projects that we work on in this country, we're always just, I wouldn't say bemused, but we're always not even surprised that spaces disappear and that they somehow get exhumed in the more interesting circumstances. As part of the project, working with Cobb's office, we went out and we laid out the site. We located where the old land was. Archaeology was done, and sure enough, they found Gaston's Wharf. They found the warehouse. So this is truly the real site. Right now, we sit down 7 feet from sea level rise. Harry Cobb has designed a non-rhetorical building that sits in a hurricane zone. So it's elevated 13 feet off the ground, but it spans almost a football field in length, creating an underside that Harry talked about respected the ground, that the ground is, the building's held up by 2-meter columns, but the ground is doing all of the work. We were asked to think about how the ground could actually commemorate those lost, and I was taken by Toni Morrison's work, A Bench by the Side of the Road, as well as many other writings that talk about that there's really not a place in North America where African Americans can go and actually sit and just think about our ancestors. There's no place, there's no Plymouth Rock, or there's not even a fictitious type of landscape. There's no building, there's no overlook. And can we create a space here where people could actually come and dwell and actually think? The site plan is very simple. As I said, the underside of the building is pretty much clear. It's all tabby, crushed shells that rise up and become the columns. To the north side, we have what we're calling the Low Country Garden, and to the south side, we're basically dealing with the remnants from the archaeology of the warehouse. At night, this landscape will be like most of the landscapes in Charleston. It'll be open. We've talked a lot about, should the site be closed? This comes a few years after the massacre at Mother Emanuel, which is 3 blocks away to the west. But as you arrive coming from the city, we create this new primary dune landscape that you walk through that kind of conceals. But then as you look back, it creates this edge, this new edge condition to the city. You can sort of see the tabby on the ground that rises up with the columns. And to the north, we're planting sweetgrass, which again talks about the gullah landscape, the arts and crafts from creating baskets. This entire landscape, you can't build on it. And we thought, what a perfect place to create a whole meadow of sweetgrass. Then there's a series of ethnic gardens that talk about the power of the landscape, the power of the medium, tribes, voices, rocks, ethnobotanic, rice culture. All of these pieces come together, and as in plan, they almost look like a colonial garden inspired by French parterres, but in actuality, they're these 3-dimensional strange vessels. And then looking back towards the warehouse, you read a wall, and along this wall will be Maya Angelou's phrase, my ancestors, I rise, I rise, I rise. That will read across this entire wall. And then as you walk through, there's a boardwalk, and along the boardwalk, there are these figures, and these figures are kneeling figures, and they are suggestive of the rice Negroes, which were in the field here. And through research, I found this one sculptural piece from Martinique, which are these giant bodies rising out of the ground, and they're white in color, stark against the blue sky. And so we're looking at, having, these figures located here. And as you walk through the reflectiveness of the stone walls, you will see yourself as well as the infinite amount of bodies that you're moving through. And so we're working now trying to figure out the scale, the repose. Should they be the same? Should they be different? And thinking about the colors, should they be in white or should it be in black? These are the full-scale mock-ups. And then lastly, as you make your way to the end of the landscape, as it hits the edge, I was inspired by the Brooks map. And is there ways in which the ground plane right at the edge of the deck as it moves out to the harbor, is there a way to tell a different story? A story about voyage, a story about loss. And I was inspired again by, at Fort Henry, there was this really, I'm assuming it's a very cheaply Xeroxed image of the Brooks map, but from a distance, it looks almost like textile. And I was taken by the abstraction of it. And so along that edge in an infinity pool, the fountain will get designed, allowing for the water to sort of rush back and drain out. And we're looking at carving the figures in concrete and tabby once again at about an 1/8 to 1/4 inch where water can collect. And this is looking at how much aggregate. And thinking about how that might play out in a serial notion where the concrete gets smooth and the water only collects itself in the shell. And then right at that edge, we've installed a 12-inch stainless steel band, which builds on the idea of flash of the spirit. So when the light hits, the spark will go off into the underside. And even with the water there, there will be this refraction that one sees. It will change during the entire day. And then looking out, the fountain drains, fills up, drains, and fills up, almost like weeping. And so you might come into the museum and you might just see this flat plane of water, and you might come out and see the bodies. And this will drain and fill up, drain and fill up. This project is expected to open in 2021, January. I want to end the lecture before the talk to talk about, some of the ideas that you've seen. Many of them were inspired years before, as a way of working with my colleague Mario and Mabel. But for my studio, we've always been interested in the cultural landscape. And in 2013, we were part of a series of artists to come and work at Spoleto, 2012 and 13. And we built next to the building, the Meminger Theater, we built what we called a rice table. And we were intrigued by that even though Charleston was built, it still works as a wetland. And within a month and a half, we built a wetland in a schoolyard. We grew rice, there were frogs, there were blue herons, and there were all kinds of cultural practices that came to the site. And the revelation for me was, you know, I had heard this in graduate school, but floodplains are always floodplains. The ground will always do what the ground wants to do. And coming out of that project, Mario and his firm and myself, we collaborated on the school would be off to the right, but we collaborated on a real project, which was the courtyard for Meminger. And we were inspired by the rice. And this is a rice dance by my colleague Ernesto Pujol, and the rice dance, the tabby ground. But we created a space where the ritual came out of this idea of thinking about the land. And over time, the space has now become verdant. And it still marks that memory of that sloping ground plane, right, and the rice ceremony. And another project in collaboration with Mario took us to Virginia Key Beach. And this was one of the first African-American beaches, segregated beaches in Miami for Blacks. And working on this project, again, the firm, we moved towards this larger idea of trying to understand, well, what was the landscape doing? And this idea of the strands of the beach, these long linear pieces, became something that we were really, really interested in. And I show these two projects because one in Miami, which is a completely different ecology than Charleston, in both, we found these places where we could enter into a conversation through the landscape. And the strands here were a protective element that allowed the beach to be a beach, but it also allowed African Americans to be in a protected space. And so very early, Mario says this drawing on the left, we did it in an airplane. I think this is the airplane sketch. But then as we developed the plan, the landscape really became this larger gesture against the building. It didn't become a set of kind of tropes, little elements you did, but it was this larger landscape that we were able to sort of bring to the forefront. And working with Mario, this was a revelation again for us in that within these landscapes, we could find something that could carry the day. And here it was these dunes that came through. And again, these strands that began to sort of work with the building and allow the building to literally sit in a landscape that was in constant flux. Thank you. My buzzer went off. 30 minutes. I wasn't that over.
Thanks. Thank you, Walter, for bringing your work to us. And just seeing you and hearing you talk about those last few projects, and maybe I'll just kind of pick up on our collaboration at Meminger and a little bit with the project in Miami. And something you said at the outset of your talk tonight, one of the, let's say, tenets or things about your work is thinking about the everyday and the mundane. So, you know, in terms of, for example, just thinking about rice, you know, I'm from the South, you know, it's the staple of the diet. You know, we don't even think about, I don't even know that we're always thinking about our ancestors and the cultivation of rice. It is just something which is there. And the ways in which you've been thinking about taking those things which are just kind of there, but there's more to it. There is still something extraordinary within the ordinary or extraordinary within the mundane. And I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit more about um, the rice table, the rice dance, and and how you've gone about sort of trying to find those things in the landscape that somehow maybe they oscillate or translate from the everyday to becoming something that I would call poetic, or even becomes otherworldly in a way.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. I speak about the mundane as almost, those things that we've forgotten that are powerful, right? I mean, I'm from North Carolina, so I mean, we're grits. I'm from a grit place, right? You're from a rice place, but the grits, it's just this powerful thing, just cooking it, and so in people's minds, to bring up something that's so common that everyone can actually tap into it is something that we try to do with these everyday projects, because again, this idea of rice, most people think of it as a staple, but it was this billion-dollar enterprise that made a lot of people wealthy, right? And so again, just bringing it up, it might allow people to sort of understand that this thing that they're eating daily, someone else grew power out of this thing, right? And in a way, can we begin to reclaim some of these things? And so the rice dance that we did with Ernesto, even people took rice tubs home, right? After the rice table, people took them home. And a year later, someone told me that their rice was still, the rice was still there. But this notion of validating something that can be personal, but also part of a larger community, right? I think that's what these things do. And lastly, in landscape, there are a lot of things that just get overlooked because everybody's looking for the shiny object, right? It's like, look at me. And people forget about curbs and gutters. Like, those are like, we spend a lot of money on sidewalks, right? And if you just think about those things that we come into contact with every day, those are places that we've been trying to exploit and finding power in those things.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Miami. I mean, we're also working on a couple of other projects together. One that, and I think Miami or the one in Los Angeles kind of stems from the one in Miami, in which we're trying to make the building disappear. I remember in Miami, we were trying to embed the building with glass so that it was this kind of flash of light. Right. Because the story is that there was no building when the beach was first settled. I mean, we met some of the people who were kids then, and they talked about being dropped off early in the morning. There was no by boat. There was no causeway being picked up at the end of the day. There was no architecture. Yeah. So they made space. They made architecture out of the landscape.
And it was, I mean, it was a very powerful story. I remember the story where they were saying, if you hurt yourself during the day, I think so. It was like, if you broke your leg, you just had to like wait for the boat. But this notion that the water was, in a way, was the building when you kind of think about it, and the vessel that came through. And I think that's why we were struck by the ecology, the mangroves, I mean, the layers that you had to like literally fight through to get to land. And we were able to kind of bring those things and pull at those strands. That was a good project, man.
Well, fingers crossed. These things take time.
Yeah, no, I want to maybe jump in a little bit here, and because I've also worked with you, Walter, on projects. And one of the first things that we worked on was the competition for the African burial ground, which in the end, as that project evolved over like 4 years of a competition from hell, we actually got rid of the shiny object, and it really became a landscape. And the memory became about the caretakers, about the community who would take care of the landscape and therefore take care of the memory. And in your fabulous new book, Black Landscapes Matter, you talk about renewable landscapes. So can you tell us more about that theory of the renewable, about, you mentioned exhumation. You know, there's the idea of validation. These landscapes are about celebration. And so what for you is at stake in the notion of renewable?
Well, it's one of these things where once I read, you know, J.B. Jackson's Necessity for Ruins, right? And that kind of it stayed with me for a long time, this idea of why do we need ruins around, right? I mean, this idea of a ruin. And, you know, spending some time in Rome and other places. And America is, maybe America is not the only place, but the thing I've noticed in my lifetime is you can't renew every day. You can't go out and say, let's do this. You got to wait for these moments. There are these moments where an event could happen, right? It could be cataclysmic, it could be social, but it's something that impacts the collective. And there are these moments then, I think, where you can begin to bring something back, something that's been lost, right? And I kind of think about always 9/11. Ken Smith, landscape architect, designed Malcolm X Plaza like prior to 9/11. And I think it was the morning after 9/11, there was a ceremony at Malcolm X Plaza, you know, about 9/11. And what it made me think about was how Malcolm X was, you know, the #1 on the FBI, you know, and just thinking about how could you have a space that would have his name, but you wouldn't probably have it until the 90s, right? That probably couldn't happen in the 70s, probably couldn't happen in the 80s. And so it takes these moments before something gets pulled back. And I'm pushing more and more to like, why do we have to wait? And can we find these other things that might allow us to have these conversations? And you see it this year, like with the George Floyd. I mean, a project that we did 4 months before George Floyd, I couldn't get anyone to talk about race or anything. And within 3 months, people are like, let's talk about this. And so, you know, and I just thought about it in like, you know, wow, it was 3 months ago that we had this conversation and you were saying you don't want to talk about these things. And so I do think there are these moments that that are places where we can push people and people are willing to move, but that doesn't happen always, right? You have to like be listening for that moment.
Yeah, and thinking about renewable, I was also, thinking about the landscape as being renewable, also struck by the project you're doing at the Oakland Museum and Dan Kiley's original landscape that you have sort of removed. I mean, it was, I don't remember the exact year that was built, but
68.
the way, yeah, 68. So we're, yeah, nearly, yeah, over 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So, but the way that you're building it back, you know, is anticipating, you know, the longevity of the thing. So, you know, it's also, let's say, renewing itself, how you're relating to the sort of the different kinds of ecologies of California. So it's also speaking to, you know, to the cultural landscape that is distinct to, you know, to different regions of California, but in this kind of renewable way that you cut back from the redwoods to allow new ferns to grow, and then over time, other things start to grow.
Yeah, I think it's a different, you know, way for us. This is the first project that, you know, we've worked on, and the Flora is not about opening day, right? I just remember back to the DeYoung Museum. It was like, you got to get the plants in for opening day. You got to get it in for opening day. At the Broad Museum, it was like, this thing has got to look good on opening day. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like opening day. This is like, you know, the plants are babies out there. And so it's really the architecture that's revealing itself opening day, right? I mean, these openings, these new openings, the new stage, there's a new opening for a cafe, there's a new ramp that takes you there. But the plants are going to become. And I think that's another way of learning. And our plants have been in now 3 months in the pandemic. And so they've had like 90 days, and I'm hoping they get some more days, but it's really set up a different way for us to start thinking about getting people to see landscape not as something that just appears, right? But that landscape is something you live with, and it's something you cultivate. And it's not just, you know, having that 30-foot tree in the beginning, but it's beginning to say, look, it might take 20 years before that, but in those 20 years, you have this other kind of space. And I think that's what we've been missing in a lot of our landscapes, because you spend this kind of money on the kind of maximum output. But if you spent less money, you could probably get more landscape. And then you would have people be part of that cultivation, which, you know, it's, again, is something that we're trying to get more of our clients to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, because I think your landscape at the new museum, you know, in Charleston, the IAM certainly does that. I mean, you asked me to contribute to an upcoming book you're doing, and I was really taken aback about the difference. You know, there'll be the history that unfolds in Harry's building, and it'll be amazing and impactful. But the landscape does a different kind of temporality. It's sonic, it's olfactory, it's, you know, it's incredibly powerful. But to maybe get back to the question of talking about race, like we've also both worked in, worked on projects about slavery. We both worked at projects at UVA.
Yep.
So how do you think the landscape helps tell those stories that oftentimes, precisely because they are in the everyday or they have longevity, can help us reckon with these difficult histories that like people would just bury?
Yeah. Well, I think if they're not tied to this kind of physical edifice, right? Which, you know, I wish we could tell more truths in our buildings, right? But people tend to shy away from that pre-existing thing by creating a new story. The landscape to me is, I don't know, I was having this discussion with people about, you know, fiction, nonfiction, fiction, myth, but the ways in which we could talk about landscape is not just in this objective way, right? I mean, landscape is phenomenological. It has this temporal aspect to it. It's alive, right? Landscapes can perish. They could be born again. At IAM, one of the first questions we had from the city was, you know, this is hurricane. Your site's going to get breached. And we're like, okay. So we know it's going to get breached, and the ethnobotanic stuff might wash out, but that might give them the ability to bring it back. And so this notion of like having something that's permanent, it's possible that there's this constant, again, cultivation of the same space. And this is what people do in New Orleans. It's what people do in South Carolina and Florida. When these events come through, you renew, right? And so, again, I think the landscape has this ability to tell broader stories. And that's something that, for me, the piece in UVA was kind of the first time I was able to do a project where it was not about a kind of a linear story, right? It's about Kitty Foster, you know, free slave, woman who's working for the boys at UVA. And, you know, it's probably the reason why I got done. There was this other big thing being done, and this thing was very small, and there were no eyes on this thing, right? And so we were able to, like, you know, really tell a different story. And this story was about, you know, death and about the spirit. And so the Shadow Catcher is really about the way in which Southern folk, you know, think about the here and the afterlife. And that's taken place through a kind of an archaeological frame. And I was really surprised that even my graphic designer, Shadow Catcher, the light, and, you know, for people to, and this was what, like almost 15 years ago, right? When we started thinking this way, people were really open to that. And now to see your project unveiled, which I can't wait to see it in person, it starts to then give these multiple perspectives and begin to suggest that we have to tell these stories in multiple ways, right? There's not one singular way to do it. And we need more ways in which we can kind of do it. And I think the landscape has that ability to take more stories, to take more things, particularly in the mundane.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we should just take the time to ask people if they do have questions, they can actually ask them in the Q&A, which is a little bit easier for us to see actually than the chat.
And so there were 3 artist projects honoring Kay.
So maybe we'll take the one of the first ones here. This is from Michelle Delk, and Michelle asks,
hey Michelle.
Michelle says, thank you for your thoughtful approach and presentation, Walter. Can you share more about how you approach building consensus or coming to decisions amongst the many viewpoints you engage during your design process?
Yeah, consensus. Good luck on consensus. That's a good question, Michelle. Hope you're doing well. Different projects, evoke different conversations. The project that I showed for Arlington, we, at our first meeting when people talked about Green Valley, I got the client to get us a van, and then we spent a day going around Green Valley. But then getting back to the design, when we presented this notion of freed, not everyone wanted it. I mean, the military dudes got up and was like, I went to Iraq, freedom, it should be freedom. And so there was a lot of debate around it. But one of the beautiful things I think about being truthful to people in a setting, that people are willing to go if the consensus, the growing consensus is in one direction. If you brought people along, at least in our experience, those who object or don't see it are willing to go along because they understand the process. And so I would say in every project, there comes a moment where you have to figure out a way, right, to bring people along. And we've gotten better at it. I wouldn't say every project is always about consensus, but we've got better at it. And it's difficult because we're dealing with people and people are different.
We have another question. This one is from Tia Brands. Let's see where it go here. Here we go. Hello, Walter, and thank you for such a beautiful presentation. I'm curious about how you considered concepts of regulation and maintenance throughout the design process. In spaces that are meant to function for liberation or contemplation, how did you make decisions about when these spaces are open to the public and when they are closed? Did this influence the design?
Say that again. I'm sorry, Mario. I was reading something from the chat. Sorry.
This was a question about
maintenance, right?
Maintenance and regulation.
Yeah.
And for spaces which are about memory or contemplation or liberation, how do you make decisions about access when the spaces are open or closed, and how does that influence your design?
The one about access, I guess I can answer quite quickly. A lot of the spaces that we're dealing with these issues of memory and race, a lot of them are just public spaces and a lot of public art. And so they don't have any perimeters. I'm trying to think if we have any spaces that are closed off. I think Knock will be open. Actually, Witness Walls in Nashville was a public art piece that are these large scale images of Blacks marching. And actually during the summer, it was graffitied. But it was good graffiti, as the art curator said, because it was over the police's eyes that we had there. Maintenance, more and more, I've gotten used to things just getting messy and not being held to a high magnitude in public space. It took me a long time to get over it, but a lot of cities are just scrapped, with money. So which means then you design in a really different way. You design for the spaces to be more resilient. We push, for better materials that you normally don't get in different places. An example is Lafayette Square Park in downtown Oakland, which is 20 years ago, but it had one of the first restrooms in Oakland. You know, we were able to use stone and other things, and 20 years later, that space is still intact. It might not be as maintained as good as I would like it, but it's there. And before I forget, Knocktown Square is actually John Robertson Jr. Park because it's named after John Robertson. Thank you for reminding me, Angela. Sorry.
And Matteo Milani wants to know if you could speak about the 2 days that you spent in Charleston, meeting with the local community as you were working on the design for the IAM.
What Matteo, yeah, IAM. What Matteo is referring to is as part of the design for the commemorative piece, we had a 2-day workshop where we invited scholars, politicians, city workers, neighbors, architects, and we went to Middleton Plantation. Spent the morning there. I feel sorry for the docent because you can imagine 20 plus people coming in thinking about low country, race. Poor docent. Doing the whole tour was basically just asking questions and questions. And at the end of that tour of Middleton Place, we ended up at an installation that they just opened. I think it's called In the Fields. And in a freedman's house, they actually listed first name of all the Middletons, right? Black Middletons. And then we went to get lunch. And as we were getting lunch, one of the descendants from the Middletons, African-American guy, was actually an actor on the plantation acting out some things. And then they told us about their first reunion, that the Middletons came, the black ones came, and the white ones came, and they've now started having yearly reunions. We then left there, we went out to Sullivan's Island, and out at Sullivan's Island, Michael Allen pointed to a sign, a Park Service sign that took him almost a decade to get done, that talked about the pest houses on Sullivan's Island. And that's where I saw Toni Morrison's chair by the road, which is this very simple, inexpensive bench that has a plaque. But what pushed me was all of us gathered around that bench and took a picture. And I was thinking, we're out here in this real landscape, and there's nothing out here but this piece by Toni that people took a picture of. And then we went through the various Gullah communities, and we ended at Mother Emanuel. But that 2-day experience, it really allowed us to have this wonderful conversation about what was appropriate to present, right, in the landscape, and how should we kind of think about memory.
Oh, and here's a question from Ken Smith.
Hey, Ken.
Can you talk about some of your mentors who inspired and influenced you when you were a student or a young practitioner?
Ken Smith. Ken, I remember those Thursday nights at Vesuvius, where we would bring projects in and drink and talk about projects, but that was kind of late 80s. I would say probably there are three people I really owe my career to. The first person is Dr. Charles Fountain, who was a brother. Unbeknownst to me, he ran the program at North Carolina A&T. I didn't know he had gone to Berkeley. He got his PhD at Ball State, but he had gone to Berkeley, and I think he was one of the first Blacks in the program. But he came back to North Carolina A&T and started a landscape program, which I was part of the first class. So that would be the first person. The second would be Garrett Ekbo, who was one of the first people that I met when I came to California. I knew him from the history, and he took me in. He was an older white guy, gentleman in his 60s. He and his wife Arlene took me in, and I became their third child. And every day I worked in the studio, read everything he could give me, ate dinner with him, did competitions at the end with him. And I was there You know, I think I was in Rome when he passed away, but his wife and him, they still major memories to me. And lastly, Randy Hester, which is from North Carolina, which I work in his practice. And Randy really gave me this kind of experience in dealing with, you know, communities. And what was great about those experiences, in most of the projects, none of the communities looked like me. So we were doing work up in Washington State, as you can imagine, out in the boonies. But working in those contexts, you know, it gave me this kind of freedom to kind of think about, right, who I was, how could I do this in those places? And so to work in other places, after working in places like that, is nothing. Right? I mean, if you worked in the woods of Washington State, you can work anywhere.
Well, maybe that fits with a question from Timothy Moore, who was asking, you know, are there types of projects that you or your firm would avoid working on? You know, what kinds of briefs or RFPs might make you pause or might give you pause?
Well, for a long time, we just didn't do housing. If anybody called and said, we're working on a housing project, we just didn't do it. Because my first few years in practice, housing architects have such a shtick. And so, you know, you just couldn't get past the architect and the way they practice. And so I just stopped doing housing because the site plans became formulaic, they became all the same. And in particularly in neighborhoods where I thought, right, the architecture, the site plans should be a lot different. They just weren't. And so we've now just actually started re-engaging in housing. We're actually working on a project in Oakland, which was the first project that my studio did. We're now back at that project 30 years later. And what's ironic is one of the residents who were there when I first went in and made a presentation is now running the project. So she, when I worked with her 30 years ago, was pushing us to come to them in a different way and not in this stereotypical way. And so when I came back to the project, I told her that she was the one who actually pushed us to stop working on housing if there wasn't the opportunity to do something substantially different.
Mabel, just wondering if you have a question here from the chat that you want to direct Walter's way.
Well, I mean, I see a question that's at the top of the Q&A from Billy Chen, our colleague on the board. Do you think you're a patient or impatient person? Do you have a short-term or long-term visions of the same place? Billy.
Oh, good question, Billy. I think I'm very impatient, right? But I've had to get over it, that once you do a project, you got to keep going. I used to sort of get attached, right, and want to go back and change things. But now, you know, I guess I'm in a better place where, you know, I'm okay with making something and moving away. If the client or the constituency wants to continue a relationship, that's something that we're always open to. 10 years after Bette Midler's New York restoration project in Queens, we just re-engaged with them. I just helped them install new solar panels and things like that. And so if there's an ongoing relationship, I think Splash Pad Park in Oakland, I think they sent some notes that they were going to be on the lecture tonight and all of that, but they're a group that I've stayed in contact with. Not everyone wants to stay in contact. And so sometimes projects are short-term and sometimes are long-term, but I have lots of friends around in different communities though. So, but definitely impatient. I want everything to be done tomorrow.
But landscape takes time.
Landscape takes a lot of time.
Yeah, there's another question from Angela Adams that is also kind of at the top. It says, hi, Walter, I'm Angela from Arlington Public Art. We're so excited to be bringing back the Knock, now known as John Robinson Jr. Town Square in Green Valley, to fruition next year. We've talked a lot about this, and you mentioned no one wanting to talk about race until George Floyd's murder this year. Someone who is typically ahead of his time, tell us about the Norfolk Project and a client community who wasn't ready for the ideas you were bringing at the time. And I think this is a really good dovetail to the question below from Millie Roy, who says, thank you for this thoughtful discussion. Walter, I wanted to know if you feel your projects subvert white supremacy in any way, physical or ephemeral. Thank you.
First to Angela, thanks for letting me have the conversations that I had with the community of Knock. She's referring to a project that preceded that, and it was in Norfolk, and we were hired almost a decade ago to do a project in Norfolk that dealt with massive resistance. And I didn't know anything about massive resistance. And it's basically citizens, white citizens, decided that they weren't going to integrate. And so they just basically resisted, and the schools closed, whites and blacks. And so we presented a project to the mayor and city manager, and he looked at me dead in the face and said, we're not ready for this. Right, and the city manager was a young African-American, Harvard grad, law, and he said, and I still remember this, he said, when I bring my daughter or son to the project, I want them, he was saying he wanted them to be happy, to not be, taken by the thing that I was presenting. And what we were presenting was, I had hired graduate students from Old Dominion and other local colleges to go into the archives and basically bring out the written word of the day. And then I was working with a school teacher, I think they were fifth graders, and the fifth graders were recording the reading. And so when you would go into the space, the sound would activate and you would hear these young kids reading from the newspapers from 1965 or 66, I forget the year. And it was just powerful. I mean, some of the things. And I think the politicians just freaked out when they sort of saw that. To the question of subverting white supremacy, I can't erase it in my projects. It's so dominant that no matter in all of the settings, all the projects that I showed, I wouldn't say I'm subverting it. It's still there in most of the places because that view has constructed most of these landscapes. And so in one way, I think that's hard to erase. And I guess the thing that we're trying to do is build up and have enough things out there so that there could be a conversation and that people can actually see when they're in these contexts that there's something different. I think what we have right now, there is no difference, so you don't actually see it. I'm just laughing at Joel Sanders.
You want to respond to ramp fatigue from Joel?
I hate ramps. I hate ramps, Joel. I have a big thing in my my studio. We talk about slope walks. That ramps, American Disabled ADA has created this idea that there's always a ramp. I'm just read the first part. I'm assuming that's what you're talking about. But I think we can talk about sloped walks more these days.
Let's see here. Yeah, here's a question from Francesca Ling, who was a former student. She took your course 11B 14 years ago. But wondering, can you speak more about the decisions for new build, preservation, or entirely different design language, and how we design to bring people into our landscapes? We create renderings with people in them, but how do you work through bringing the audience into your spaces?
It's a lot of questions. I guess I'll just sort of speak to, this notion of preservation, new build. I mean, in landscape, it's just really hard unless the landscape has been canonized or thought of having some importance. Landscapes just get wiped away. And one of the things that, again, in projects, we like to try to hold on to things, right? If you look at some of our work from the De Young to Splash Pad, I've never, see if I can say this. Yeah, I've never planted a palm tree in any design, right? And people say, why'd you plant palms? It's like, they were there, right? And so at the De Young, the palm trees were like close to 100 years old. And so we were able to take them. At Splash Pad, it was the place where discarded palm trees arrived, right? And so it's this notion. So I like that when there's something there in a landscape, I want to hold on to it. And it could be the ground, it could be flora, it could be inert material, et cetera. The other part of your question, about experience, getting people to kind of understand landscape, a lot of the time, if we have a good client, we tell them that my representations cannot tell you what the space is going to feel like. And even virtual reality can't help you explain the space. I'll give you an example. If you're in a space, a landscape that's been designed, and you go there and it's 100 degrees outside, I guarantee you're going to feel different in that space, whether you come on a day where the temperature changes. And so you have all of these other things that impact space. And so what we try to talk about is kind of the textual, the feeling of the space, the materials, how big it is, but never trying to say it's going to feel like this. And more, I think we've gotten better at the kind of the material quality and also thinking of landscape as a medium, that it's not a lot of just stuff, but it's like the sky is really important. The ground is really important, right? Inert material is really important. It's how you compose those things.
Yeah, and I missed the first part of Francesca's question, which had to do with preserving existing historical landscapes in terms of how they might be painful. But that also leads me to a question about the project in Charleston, the IAAM project, in terms of, and I'm thinking about those reflective surfaces and the figures, and I'm not sure if I want to walk through that.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that when you're designing it?
It's I want people to feel like they might not want to walk that way. I mean, this was one of the conversations that we were having around the museum was, do we want to create spaces, that make people, take a step back, and think about it. I was taken by, some of the figurative pieces. I mentioned the one in Martinique, but there are others, around the world, particularly in the diaspora, where the figuration, the sculpture is so powerful in your face that it does begin to have a reaction to your body. And the ones that I was just showing you in white, I have them in my studio now. And from the clay to the scale, it really changes. And this notion, so now I'm struggling with, should they be black, should they be white? I actually like the white figure because it is more ghostly. Reminds me of, what's his name, Siegel's work, who does a lot of the Holocaust sculptures. There's a particular one here in San Francisco. So on one end, it's the first project that I think we've made where the aesthetic and the experience is something that I haven't done before. This is like the first figurative piece that I've done, in sculpture. It's the first, that horizontal piece with the bodies carved. Again, this kind of figuration is something that I haven't done before, and it's kind of scary, sort of broaching that. But I think it's a place where I think that emotive quality should happen here at this space.
Yeah. And maybe before we wrap up, this is not a question that's in the chat, but I don't know if most people know this about you, but you you studied architecture, you're a landscape architect, but then you decided to go back and get an MFA. And I'm wondering if you might just kind of, you know, in closing, might talk a little bit about your experience in terms of getting an MFA and your decision to do that.
Yeah. The decision came about, it had a lot to do with Charleston, actually. It came a lot to do with the work that I was doing with Mary Jane Jacobs and Spoleto, and some of the other artists that I was having a conversation with. And it seemed at the time in my career I wasn't having those conversations in landscape architecture. I wasn't having these conversations in urban design. I wasn't having them in architecture. But people in art were having these conversations. A friend of mine, Rick Lowe, Diasporic, I mean, I was looking at their practices and wondering how I could shape mine. And then I got invited to apply to School of the Art Institute. And then actually going there and actually being part of a community where that challenged this idea of culture and race. I mean, for 3 years, it was like this paradise of being in a place where people were almost unfettered, you know, to talk about it in ways that was not about the collective, it was about individuals. Right? In art school, individuals were out making work, so it was never about corralling people, right, in the same like we do in school and in studio. And so it was kind of refreshing. And I always tell the story, there was one moment, you know, I was in a seminar, I was in a funerary sculpture seminar, and I'm sitting beside these kids, and we're going around the room, and the professor asked everybody who they were. And there was this young person, probably in their like early 20s. And I was taken by what they said to introduce themselves. It's like, my name is blah, 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 and I sew. I've been sewing all my life. And they said it with such pride, right? And I was like, wow. And I got to know this person over 3 years in the Fiber Arts program. And sure enough, that sewing was the thing. And I was like, wow, what a different way to empower. And so that was something that was really revelatory to me. And then even going back to teaching, I try to take that step back and try to make sure that the students are bringing themselves to the work, right? And there's no kind of like scripting yourself down, but you can be present in the work.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Thank you.
I'll toss it to my colleague Mabel.
Yeah. So should we wrap up, or do you want to? Are you telling me to wrap up, or the last words?
We could probably talk all night, but we probably shouldn't do that to
Yeah.
You want to mention, you want to close with your project that's coming out, Mabel?
Oh, yes, I guess I should mention. Yes, that the three of us actually have been working together for over 1.5 years. Both Walter and Mario will be showing commissioned projects at a show called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, that will open at MoMA at the end of February. So if you are in New York, hopefully the museum will be open, and you can come see the show. There'll be a fantastic catalog that will come out. Actually, it's a critical field guide. It's not really a catalog. And I think there should be some, you know, interesting programming. Hopefully we're going to do something with the Architectural League. So, you know, both these conversations continue in other forums.
And I just saw in the chat, Bob Shipley from Buffalo is there. Hey, Bob. And I wouldn't do anything differently about the solar strand other than spending more money on the earthworks, particularly the amphitheater. That's a little jab.
Well, thank you, Walter. It's certainly been a pleasure to be in conversation with you, to see you, and we're looking forward to February. And I'd like to thank everyone who has been with us this evening for attending this this session of current works. The Architectural League would also like to thank our members for your ongoing support. And you can find out much more about the programs of the League and what we're up to at the League's website, archleague.org, and our coming events beginning in January of 2021. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Walter.
Mabel. Thanks, Mario. It's good to see you guys. It's good to be in conversation with you guys for over an hour. It's awesome.
Yeah.
See you guys soon, okay?
All right.
See you. Good night.
Good night.